Okay, Gen Z, you are officially the ballsiest generation ever. And I, as your millennial defense lawyer, could not be more proud. Hundreds of people marched over the weekend towards the seat of the government in central Lima under a heavy police presence. Groups of young people threw stones, petrol bombs, and fireworks at law enforcement, who responded with tear gas and rubber bullets. So, what caused them to do this? Well, quite a laughably simple reason, actually. They're adamantly refusing, rightfully so I might add, to pay the welfare pension benefits of the old boomers who screwed over the economy and their futures. Social unrest has increased since the Boularte government passed a law on September 5th requiring young people to contribute to private pension funds despite job insecurity and an unofficial employment rate of over 70%. We are marching against corruption for life and against the crime that is killing us every day. 28-year-old Adriana Flores told AFP. Meanwhile, on the other side of the Atlantic, we're seeing a very similar situation play out in Morocco. Morocco is actually a very beautiful country. I've actually been there myself during my travels. Beautiful beaches, sceneries, and Assassin's Creed-esque architecture. And it's an incredible tragedy that its people are forced to live in abject poverty. I often saw little school children, as young as 5 or 6, running around the streets asking for money there. Despite all these problems, however, the government has decided they'd rather spend $35 billion on the 2030 World Cup instead of, maybe actually improving healthcare, education, and public services its own citizens so desperately need. In a way, this kind of reminds me of exactly what's going on with American colleges. For decades, tuition costs have skyrocketed absolutely out of this universe. College has become totally unaffordable and useless for most young people. And yet, they'd rather invest millions into college football stadiums and the salaries of head coaches. And I couldn't be more proud of Gen Z right now, fighting back against these corrupt governments and bankrupting these useless colleges, giving out useless degrees. Now, of course, this was all initially inspired by the violent, bloodthirsty Gen Z protest in Nepal, which ultimately ended up being successful. After a week of relentless protests, the corrupt boomer government got thrown out and Gen Z elected their own new president through Discord. Yes, you heard that right, Discord. This literally has to be the most Gen Z thing ever. A funny meme that paradoxically also has the power to topple entire governments and start revolutions. This was the first domino that tipped over and ignited a global Gen Z revolution that might just go down in history books as the moment that changed our futures forever. Hey guys, we set out on a mission during the summer to take down the biggest, most vile Gen Z hater, the Angry Guy. A straight up horrible human being who hates Gen Z so much he even celebrates them dying. Thanks to you, we've gained a ton of ground on him over the summer, and we've set a new goal to surpass him in subscribers and defeat him once and for all by the end of the year. So, if you're new here and enjoying this content, definitely consider subscribing and helping us take down the biggest, most evil, final boss Gen Z hater. With your help, we can absolutely do this. If you watch an Olympic event today, you'll know that for elite athletes, running a 4-minute mile is nothing. Hundreds of athletes break this benchmark every year. It's not a big deal at all anymore. But not too long ago in the 1950s, this wasn't the case at all. Back then, the 4-minute mile was considered a mythical, impossible standard to break. Many great athletes tried, all of them fell short. That is until May 6, 1954, Roger Bannister hit a perfect kick on the final lap and just barely squeezed in this historical feat, finishing in 3 minutes 59.4 seconds. But this wasn't even close to the most shocking thing that would soon happen. The most shocking thing was that the very next year, just 1 year later, 14 more runners would follow suit and break a 4-minute mile. It took almost 3,000 years from the first Olympics in ancient Greece to 1954 for the first man to break 4 minutes in the mile, and yet it only took a single extra year for another 14 of them to do so. The important lesson this teaches us is that overcoming these impossible, mythical barriers is far more mental than it is physical. It wasn't as if human evolution just magically took a huge leap forward in 1954. It was simply that we saw the first person break 4 minutes, the mental block was removed, and we all realized it wasn't that impossible at all. And I believe we are seeing the beginning stages of the exact same scenario play out in the global, worldwide Gen Z protests going on right now. Nepal was our Roger Bannister, our first real-life example where we actually saw young people rise up and force meaningful change successfully. Then we saw similar protests erupt all over Nepal and other parts of Southeast Asia like Sri Lanka and Bangladesh. And now these protests have spread like wildfire all the way to Peru and Morocco, across continents, oceans, and cultures. And now the big question that I'm sure is on everyone's mind right now, could this happen in the West? Because that would be a true watershed moment. That would be the epitome of Gen Z. But before we explore that possibility, however, there is one major issue I feel compelled to speak out about with the platform I have. During the Gen Z protest in Morocco, a policeman responded to the protesters by literally ramming into and running over the protesters as if he was just playing GTA. Now, beyond being incredibly deadly and dangerous, this is just straight up unacceptable, inexcusable behavior coming from a country that is set to host the World Cup. I don't have the biggest platform in the world by any means, but I do have something, and I'm going to do my best to call this out and expose it. We need to do everything we can to boycott this event and send a clear message. The World Cup is one of the most prestigious and popular sporting events in the world. Hosting the World Cup is a privilege and not a right. Whichever country hosts the World Cup always gets the privilege of receiving a huge boost to their economy and their international image. And it's simply unacceptable for the hired state police in that country to use vehicular homicide as a way to resolve conflicts. So I encourage all of you to share this video, spread this message across social media and in real life, and hold the Moroccan government accountable for their actions. Gen Z in Nepal, Peru, and Morocco have shown us that meaningful change is indeed possible if enough of us are willing to stand up. And with how much they've risked their lives rebelling against their governments, the least we could do to support them is by exposing these horrific, unacceptable acts and boycotting the World Cup in 2030 as much as humanly possible. Part 2. Could this happen in the West? So now it's time to address the elephant in the room. Is this something we could possibly see happen in the West as well? Well, it's definitely possible. Those who want to write it off as being totally impossible and hyperbolic are just completely ignorant of history. Anytime inequality has shot up to these obscene levels, revolutions have often followed. There is one key difference, however, between the situation in Southeast Asia and here in the West. In every Southeast Asian country that has produced a successful revolution, the protesters were completely and totally unified across political lines and parties. Here in the West, however, the elites have done a great job at separating us and pitting us against each other, dividing and conquering. Black versus white, men versus women, left versus right, etc. And because of that, personally, I think a civil war is much more likely than an all-out revolution. But as interesting as this all sounds, none of these, in my opinion, are the best solution. Sure, it can feel incredibly empowering and interesting to start a revolution, but we have to remember that there are real-life physical consequences for this. This was a very level-headed comment that I read that, in my opinion, best represents the best approach going forward. We live in the wealthier parts of the world, should pay close attention. These nations' youths got fed up because they felt trapped in a way our youth doesn't yet. Don't quite agree with that part. I think that part, our youth are definitely feeling that. But the frustrated sentiment that old, out-of-touch politicians don't care about the youth, the future, and flaunt the unfairness of the system in their face, that sentiment exists here too. But we have the opportunity to still address these issues without massive violence for now. And we should simply do that because the economic cost of gradual peaceful reform is so much cheaper than going through revolutions. And he's absolutely right about this. 74 people died and 2,000 more got injured in the Gen Z Nepal protest. Now, you might look at the end result and say the ends justify the means, but it's important we remember that these are not just numbers on a paper here. These are real human beings with families and loved ones. Would you simply look at it as 74 deaths if one of them was your friend, your family member, or even yourself? Now, of course, I'm not going to sit up here and be an idealist about this either. I'm not going to sit up here and lecture you about how violence is never the answer. The cold hard truth when you look at history is that sometimes violence, unfortunately, is the answer. But it should always be the last answer and the last resort. And as this comment said, right now, we do still have the opportunity to fix it before it gets too out of hand and one of us gets seriously hurt or worse. So, what's the solution? Alright, so you've heard me criticize the right and capitalism a lot in all my videos, but for this video, I'm going to switch gears a bit and call out the left. As we mentioned earlier, the main reason these Gen Z uprisings have been successful in other countries is because they're all collectively unified against the government elites who are actually the real problem. And the reason it's not happening in the West is because the political elite have successfully pitted us against each other, and I absolutely blame the left more for this than the right. You see, I do actually agree with a lot of the premises of the left. I do actually believe women and minorities do face serious challenges and unfair disadvantages. But so does everyone, and young guys in general. And when the economy just sucks this damn bad for everyone across the board, it is just incredibly snobby and elitist to lecture young men about their privilege. If we were all making a decent wage and decent living, we would definitely be more sympathetic to the plight of women and minorities. But when young men are barely making enough to pay rent themselves, and you tell them they should give up the already very little money they're making because they're quote-unquote privileged, of course they're just going to tell you to screw yourself, and rightfully so. And it's not just incredibly out of touch, it's downright factually incorrect as well. Young Gen Z and millennial men today were born way after the patriarchal oppression of women era. If you want to blame anyone for the plight of women and minorities, you can definitely blame older generations of men. And I'm not even talking about the boomers here. I'm talking about older men generations from the Roman Empire until now. But Gen Z and millennial men had nothing to do with any of that. There's a lot of talk about how Gen Z men have become incredibly conservative and brainwashed by the far right, and while I agree with this assessment, their diagnosis of the problem is completely incorrect. The reason young men have gone so far to the right is because they've been completely antagonized and demonized by the left. And since we unfortunately live in a two-party system, there's just no other place to go to than to the right. This is why so many young men are overwhelmingly capitalist, even though capitalism is the very system that's specifically screwing them over the most. Under capitalism, they've been exploited by corporations for dogshit wages. They've been forced to become wage slaves for unbearable boomer bosses. They've entered an impossible housing market where, let's face it, they're just never going to own a house because boomers bought up 5 vacation properties each in the 60s when it was way more affordable to do so. And now they use houses as a capitalist speculative asset for profits rather than what it actually should be, which is, a place to actually live in. You have to really antagonize the living crap out of them for them to get to a point where they'd literally rather have capitalism than deal with your BS. And for you young guys out there watching who are pro-capitalist, I just want to say, I know we've argued and debated capitalism a lot throughout the videos. And I want to say that although I vehemently disagree with you about capitalism, I've been there, I get it, and I see you. As bad as it may be, whatever the left is offering you is way worse. The bottom line is this: whether we have a violent revolution or, in my opinion, the more preferable solution, a peaceful and productive reform, the only way real change can happen is if we're all united against the real enemies here and not against each other. This is why the Gen Z revolutions around the world have been so successful, and why we should all be taking notes here in the West on exactly how they did this. Whether it's about violent revolutions or quitting soulless BS 9 to 5 jobs, it really feels as if Gen Z is literally the only generation with any sort of balls, and we explore this more in this video right here. Check it out. I'll see you there. Thanks for watching.